Here are 9 tips that you can present impactful, memorable and engaging text webinars in this episode. You're listening to episode 67 of the Tax Professionals podcast.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
I've got an upcoming webinar that I'm doing for MBL seminars in March this year and a few others throughout the year. And I did quite a few webinars last year too, including one with the ATT and CIOT. Back in my third year of uni, I had to do a presentation on my dissertation. I used to hate presenting and I was so nervous and anxious about delivering this presentation. But it wasn't a topic that I knew extremely well and I'd spent ages on my dissertation, so I knew it from back to front. I was in the room watching others present theirs and getting more and more nervous as it was coming closer and closer to my turn to present. And I thought some of the presentations before mine were just really excellent. And it comes to my turn and I stand up and walk over to the whiteboard and start presenting. I pick up the pen and start writing on the whiteboard. And I start writing in the top right hand corner of the whiteboard. I haven't left myself enough space to finish writing my equation, so I rub it out and I start again, still writing in the top right corner and making the exact same mistake again. But this time, rather than rub it out again, I trooper on and manage to squeeze in the equation onto the whiteboard, and I look like a right fool. As I return to my seat, I just know that I did awfully. I couldn't get my words out, couldn't speak clearly, and I didn't even make sense to myself, never mind the other people in the room. Since then, I've looked back on this occasion many times and have just never wanted to present this awfully again, ever. So I've worked on getting much better at presenting. It's not something that I'm naturally good at, but no presentation or webinar that I've done since then has been close to as awful as the uni one. And recently I felt like I've gotten into a pretty good flow with doing them, and I've had some good feedback on webinars that I've done recently. I know I've still got a lot of work to do and improvements to make, but I feel like I now know a lot about what you need to do a good job, and for me now it's primarily just practice for getting better now. So I do want to share my tips with you to help you to present memorable, impactful and engaging webinars, and not memorable in the way that my uni presentation was. The tips that I'm sharing in this episode have taken me from someone who was purely awful, terrible at doing presentations to someone who I think at least now is good at doing presentations to a decent standard. And if these tips can do that for me, then they can certainly help you to do the same too. Rough timings for each of the tips can be found in the details section of the episode within your podcast player, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP67. The MBL webinar that I'm doing on the 8th of March is on the managed service company rules, covering the rules in detail, the risks and how to reduce them. It's aimed at tax professionals and accountants. I know the managed service company rules, the MSC rules, are quite niche, and so I don't expect many of you to have heard of them before, but they're typically relevant in the case of contractors, businesses in the recruitment sector, temporary workers, and umbrella companies. I have put a link in the show notes to this episode so that you can get full details and sign up if you want to. The only link you'll need to remember for this episode is a link to the show notes, which can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP67. TTPP67 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 67. All links mentioned throughout the episode are included in the show notes. If, like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James at the Tax Recruitment Company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James could help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP67. You can book a chat with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So, get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he is currently recruiting for many roles in this area. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. So tip number 1 is tell people what is coming up and what they can expect to learn in the webinar. This prepares the attendees' minds and brains to get ready to take on the information that's about to come their way. So, in relation to presentations, you may have heard the saying before, tell people what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And this sequence of events is just like, I suppose, a known thing when you're trying to teach people things, because if you tell them up front, they will remember and understand and process the information better because they're expecting it. Obviously, then you need to tell them the information. And then if you give them a recap at the end, it reminds them of what you've told them. And that just helps them to memorise it, remember it better. Also, when you tell people what's coming up, they may be particularly interested in a certain section of the webinar or presentation that you're doing. And so if you can do that and they kind of get like excited and are looking forward to it, they will tune in more to that section and get more from it and probably be more engaged with you in that section too. All those things can just be useful. So yeah, tip number 1 is tell people what is coming up and what they can expect to learn. So nothing kind of groundbreaking here at this point, but something that's important to do. Tip number 2 is use the notes section within PowerPoint to add prompts for things that you want to say and even potentially scripts if you want to go that far. So this one for me has been an absolute lifesaver. So if you go into PowerPoint and you do like a slide, underneath that slide you can add in notes so that when you're presenting you can see a little kind of smaller screen of the actual slide itself, as well as have your notes on the screen at the same time. And when you're doing webinars, you can actually have it so that the people who are watching don't see that, so they will see the full presentation slide as normal, nothing else, and you can get all those other things. And this has been an absolute lifesaver for me, because one of the biggest problems for me when I've given presentations and webinars previously, particularly in the case of the university one, is I just cannot think what to say in the moment because of the nerves and the anxiety. Like my mind would just go completely blank, so then I would end up not saying much or kind of tripping over my words trying to think what to say, and it just didn't come out particularly clearly. Like I had no structure at all really when it came to doing my presentation at uni. But using this note section has made a huge difference for me because I can put in little prompts to say like say something about this or explain X or tell them about Y. Like I don't like full scripts personally because I feel like it's too robotic. So I like to have prompts. Don't just say only the things in the prompts, but the things in the prompts are like the most important things to me, the things I absolutely want to say and do not want to forget about. So all those things happen within the note section of the presentation for me. And I actually used this technique a lot in the first tax research masterclass that I did. So I had, in the note section, I had outlines of the stories that I wanted to tell to make sure that I told them in a good order and made sure I got the key points in. Particularly because I'm quite new to storytelling in like the way that I am now. It's not something that I just do kind of off the cuff. I do prepare them up front to make them more engaging, more interesting, and to make the points better. And I also used it to prompt me to give live demonstrations of things. So I would have things that say like, do live demo on this now, and then there would be a link to where I'd need to go on the website somewhere. So I'd open up that and then I'd show people things live, and that just worked really, really well for me. I think I really needed a lot of prompts and stuff for the masterclass anyway, because there's actually about 6 hours of content over 2 webinars. So if I was doing, say, an hour presentation or webinar, then I probably wouldn't go into the amount of detail that I did for this one, because I'd likely got it more kind of fresh in the mind and stuff. But for the amount of content that I did, I didn't want to miss any key points, particularly because people were paying to attend. So, as I kind of say, you can still do things other than the prompts and stuff and any scripts that you kind of write, but you at least then make sure you always cover like the most important things, the things that you absolutely need to say if you've got the prompts there. Now, just on the topic of prompts, like I know you can use the slides themselves as the prompts for the thing that you want to talk about, but I'll come on to more about like what should be in the slides, etc. in the next tip. I will just say don't go completely overboard with prompts, because if you've got too many prompts in the note section on a single slide, then you will lose yourself within those prompts and it will just become easy to miss them or not say any of them at all. You might even then end up saying it on one of the slides for too long, which is not a good thing in my opinion. So yeah, tip number 2 is use the note section within the PowerPoint presentations to add prompts and scripts to remind you to basically say things. So tip number 3 is make sure that your slides, if you're using a PowerPoint in particular, are simple and visual. So I remember being on a presentation on an employment taxes topic that was being delivered by one of the big 4 accountancy firms, and it was on a topic that was really relevant to me, and I was looking forward to it and was interested to kind of hear a bit more about this topic because it wasn't something that really came up day to day in my role, although I knew about it and I could kind of advise on it if I needed to. And it came to this one slide in particular, and I just remember it, and it was completely full of text, like sentences after sentence, really small text, like the full screen was just text crammed in to the screen. I was just remember like looking at the text, trying to read the text, trying to listen to the person who was presenting and talking about it. And as we well know, as a man, I cannot multitask. So I ended up doing both of those things terribly because I didn't really focus on either one of them. I didn't take in much from that slide at all. And whilst this one was like a particularly bad slide in this presentation for being heavy on text, text-heavy slides were a theme throughout this presentation, and it just didn't work well, in my opinion. I never knew whether to look at the screen and read what was in front of me or to listen to the person who was speaking. And I think for an attendee of a webinar or a presentation, it should be easy for the attendee to know whether they need to listen or read. And when you give them a choice, they don't know which one to do, unless, of course, you keep instructing them, which I think would be a really unusual way to deliver a webinar. But I suppose that's something you could do too. And I think if this person who was delivering this presentation just had real simple slides, so minimal text, and had, say, visuals, potentially pictures or diagrams or flowcharts, it would have been much better, because then they could have talked around what was on the screen, and people won't get lost in trying to read what was on the slides in front of them. So I just do think that, personally, your slides should be minimal, simple, and visual, and they should supplement the speech rather than the other way around. One of my pet peeves is when people just read off their presentation slides, because I just think, what's the point? If all you're doing is delivering a presentation where you're reading exactly what's on the screen, you might as well send the presentations around and just let people read it for themselves. So use the slides to supplement yourself, and it will just make the whole presentation, the whole webinar, much more effective. Just coming back to tip 2 very briefly about using the note section for prompts. Obviously, if you keep your slides so simple and don't put much text on, you can actually use the text or even the pictures, etc., on the slides as prompts. And I definitely did that. I definitely do that a lot. I then just use the note section where I want additional prompts, where I don't want to put something on the screen because it might be too detailed or it might not be necessary to put it in writing. But if I just want to remind myself to say something above and beyond what I'll be prompted to do from the presentation slides, because I like to keep them simple because I think that's more effective, then that's what I'll do. In terms of visuals, things that I think are good to put in presentation slides are diagrams, flowcharts, tables, pictures, anything that doesn't include lots of text that people can kind of look at a glance and take in a lot of information quickly, and don't get kind of bogged down with looking at the slides. If you do want to use a lot of text on slides for whatever reason, or even if it is just a minimal amount of text, I recommend that you have the text come in like bit by bit. So through the animations that you can have in PowerPoint, for example, you can have like the first bullet point come in, then you can have the second one come in, then you can have the third one come in. If you do that, it stops people looking at the screen and trying to read everything that's on there. You can bring on one sentence at a time, so then they can look at that sentence as you're talking about it, and then once they've looked at it or read it, they will listen to you more if that's the way that they like to do things. So yeah, having the text coming bit by bit is another thing you can do just to help keep the slides simple and stop people just reading them throughout it. Tip number 4 is to break down complicated information into like bite-sized chunks and potentially even like step by step. The thing is with verbal information, particularly when it's a new topic to someone and it's complicated, is it's actually hard to listen to someone speak really quickly and then to process it and understand that you need time to think about that information that you've just been given so that you can kind of fully understand it. And what breaking stuff down into more bite-sized chunks or into step-by-step information does is it gives people that time to process what you've told them, understand it, and then they can understand the next bit, and then the next bit. But if you literally just talk really quickly and don't break something down step by step, then you could lose them in the first sentence, have another 50 sentences, and because they lost you on the first sentence, the other 49 were completely pointless to them. So really breaking it down, making it simple, probably over-explaining it in some cases, I think is better on a presentation, generally speaking, than it is to under-explain something, especially where the point is a really important point for people to understand. If it's like absolutely critical that they understand this point that you're talking about, make sure that you spend enough time on it, break it down enough so that they understand it. If it's a point that's not particularly important and it doesn't really matter whether they do or do not understand something, then you don't have to spend a lot of time on it and break it down step by step. But absolutely on the crucial things, break it down step by step. So just as an example, if you're doing a webinar and you are about to talk about a particular tax rule and you want to teach the attendees about that tax rule, and let's say that the tax rule has a bunch of conditions that need to be met in order for the tax rule to apply, then you can literally have one slide for each condition. So then you can talk about the condition first, like say exactly what the condition is, and then you can talk around that condition. Then you can move on to the next condition, say what the condition is, talk about that condition, maybe give some examples for when that condition is met, when it isn't met, and just make sure that people understand that condition. Do not just have one slide that has all of the conditions on it. Let's say there's 5 conditions, that has all 5 conditions, you literally just read them out one by one, because by the time that you get onto that next page, they're not going to remember all the conditions. Now, even if you break it down into, say, one slide per condition, the likelihood is that they won't remember every last bit of every single condition, but they will certainly remember a lot more and understand a lot more than what they would if it was on one slide. Also, if you have got a complicated scenario that you want to talk about, then you can kind of build up to that scenario. So first, start with the most simple scenario first, then add something on that's a little bit more complicated, and then add something on that's a little more complicated until you built yourself up to that complicated scenario, because then by the time that you've got to that complicated one, people have understood like each stage to get there, and it just makes them understand it. So yeah, tip number 4 is break down complicated information into bite-sized chunks, potentially even to step by step. Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or to discuss available tax rolls, get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. His contact details can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP67, or you can book a call with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So tip number 5 is to use polls and ask questions of the attendees to keep them engaged and make the session more interactive. So when I did a webinar with the CIOT on how to research a tax technical query, this is one thing that they requested, is like as a compulsory thing, we needed to have polls, because they said it makes it more interactive, it makes people listen more, it makes them pay more attention, and so it just means that attendees get more out of it, and I absolutely agree with that. Polls are a great way to keep people listening and understanding. It is so easy to become bored and switched off on a webinar if literally all you're doing is sitting there and kind of being bombarded with information. Questions make you want to listen more, because if you know that a question's coming up, you want to make sure that you've listened to what was said so that when the question comes up that you can answer it. So that's one thing from it, and of course just the fact it's making you think anyway to answer that poll or click the button. That is in itself is better than sitting there and just letting everyone listen to what's being said. Also, polls and questions actually are a good way to test people. As humans, the way our memories work is if you learn a new piece of information and then you recall it a short amount of time after that, it makes you remember it for longer than if you didn't recall it kind of shortly after learning it. So it is also good for that, actually. Both polls and questions are good. I personally like questions a little bit more because they kind of take that engagement and interaction step a little bit further than a poll. Polls usually you've got, say, 3 options of an answer to choose, A, B or C, and you choose one of them. Whereas if you ask a question where people have to answer in words, it engages their minds a little bit more. So I do use both of them in webinars that I do now, but I do have a preference towards questions for those reasons just mentioned. So tip number 5 is ask polls and questions to keep the attendees engaged. Tip number 6 is tell relevant and real stories. Stories just make you kind of stand out and make you much more relatable, make things, I suppose, it helps people to see things on a practical level, which is much better than just like pure theory. So for me personally, I'm not naturally a good storyteller. It's just not me. But I'm the type of person that just likes to get completely to the point, minimal words, don't faff about, just get the information across. But when it came to the podcast, I thought that if I could get better at storytelling, it would make the podcasts more interesting and engaging on topics that my friends describe as dull and boring. So I had kind of been on this journey of becoming better at telling stories, and I read 2 books. I've listened to loads of podcasts on storytelling. I've watched a bunch of YouTube videos, and I've learned a load of different tools that can make you tell better stories that are more engaging, more interesting, and get your point across better, make it more memorable, etc. And after kind of learning these tools, I started practicing in a tame environment where I couldn't make a fool of myself. So I could maybe start telling them to myself when I'm kind of just doing mundane tasks around the house. I can record them for the podcast, and it is a tame environment because I can edit them and then re-record them if I don't do a good job of it. And I'd never used them live before at all, any of these tools I've learned, until it came to my first masterclass that I taught. And I just kind of got to a point where I was like, I just need to give this a try now. Like, there's no point me learning all these things if I'm not going to put it into practice. And I genuinely had no idea how it would go when I told these stories. But I did spend absolutely ages drafting the stories, creating outlines of them, practicing them, so that by the time that I told them live in the webinar, that I could tell them well, basically. But I was still nervous to tell them live. I was wondering, like, will people think that the approach is weird or unusual? Will they not land with people? Will people think they're too long? And, a bunch of all these other things that all these other things were just going through my mind, kind of. And one of the first stories I told, I just felt like it was way too long and potentially unclear. And I just got to the end and thought I didn't tell that one particularly well. But I was happy with how pretty much all the other stories went. And after the masterclass, one of the attendees told me that they found the stories great, actually. Like, for them, it made me more relatable. It was nice for them hearing that I've kind of gone through troubles and I've made my own mistakes. And it made it more memorable for them because it kind of had more to it than just plain, like, boring facts. And the one that I was unhappy with, actually, was the one that they remembered the most because they said it was, like, so relatable. So even though I thought I made myself look a little bit like an idiot because it was too long and I felt like I rambled for a bit, they actually thought it was really good. And from this experience, it just made me realise how good stories really are, because it just made me connect with the attendee. Well, I suppose the opposite way. It made attendees connect better with me than they would have done if I didn't tell the stories. And one of the people who attended actually said to me, they said they think the fact that I told the stories that I did, that made me, like, more vulnerable and human and relatable, made people more interactive throughout the session itself, because they felt like it was a safe space. If I could sit there and be vulnerable, then why can't they too? Why can't they ask a question that they think is potentially a silly question? And all those things. So when it comes to kind of telling stories and thinking of stories to tell, think of the point that you want to make, and think of kind of examples and experiences that you've had that relate to that point, and then draft a story around it. The best resource by far that I've had for getting better at telling stories is this book I've read called Storyworthy by a person called Matthew Dix. This guy is just an absolutely excellent storyteller, and once he breaks it kind of down so well in his book as well to make it, like, understandable and digestible for someone like me who is just not at all a natural storyteller. It's just made me a lot better. So if I can become better at telling stories, you absolutely can too. Because, as I say, my natural inkling in life is to be straight to the point. Don't ramble. Don't go off topic. Just get straight to the point. But here's really converted me into kind of the power and the benefit of telling stories. And on webinars, which nowadays can be quite dull because there's so many of them and you're not in a room with other people, etc., they make a huge difference, I think, for connecting with the audience and making you more engaging and interesting to listen to. So tip number 7 is give live demonstrations through sharing your screen. So rather than just tell someone about something, can you show them about it instead? So a lot of the time, showing is better than just telling. And when it comes to tax rules, you might be thinking, well, how can I share my screen and give a live demo of something if I'm talking about a tax rule? Well, I haven't got an answer for that in every single case, because obviously it depends, and sometimes you might not be able to, sometimes you might be able to, but you just need to be a little bit creative about it. So if, for example, you wanted to show that the benefits of setting up as a limited company as opposed to a sole trader in terms of the tax savings that come, then could you have an Excel sheet where it has like a comparison of, say, the sole trader versus the limited company, and where you can put in, say, a turnover per year, and it can show you the different amounts of, say, tax that is paid and money that the person ends up having in their bank account at the end of it. And by changing the numbers, etc., that could be the live demo that you do. So you show your screen, you've got the Excel sheet, you change numbers, and you see what the different outputs is. That might be better than just having a bunch of different slides that have screenshots of it, because, well, it's just a little bit different. Everyone tends to use slides, and not many people tend to do live demos, and I think you can get a lot out of doing it. So that's just an example. Think creative about it. Think if there's a way that you can make something a live demonstration rather than just having a presentation slide on there along with you speaking over it. So tip number 7 is give some live demonstrations through sharing your screen. Tip number 8 is to set exercises during the webinar. So this might not be appropriate in every case, but if it is, then definitely give exercises a go, because it takes engagement and interaction of the people who are attending to the next level, like further than just a poll or a simple question. The thing is about exercises as well is you're getting people to really think in detail about what you've just kind of taught them and spoke to them about. And if they can process that information, use it very quickly, they can kind of solidify their understanding, and it also helps them to remember it for longer too. And also, if they get something wrong, let's say that they've done the exercise and they put the answer in, then they've got some instant feedback that they are incorrect, and you can probably tell them why they're incorrect as well. And that is just a very powerful way to help someone understand something and learn something better. So tip number 8 is, if you can, give and set some exercises to people. So tip number 9 is, I suppose, more generic and applies to a lot of webinars and presentations, talking, providing advice, etc., is to tailor your language and presentation to the audience that you're going to be presenting to, giving the webinar to. So, for example, last year I did a webinar with CPD Store in relation to the managed service company rules, again, actually, like the one that I'm going to be presenting for MBL webinars later in the year, which is a more ramped up version of it, much more in depth than the one I did for CPD Store. But anyway, for CPD Store, their audience is accountants, like general practice accountants, generally speaking, small practices with maybe 1 to 5 accountants within that firm. So straight away there, they haven't got a lot of access to, say, tax advice. They're going to be good at all the accounting things like doing balance sheets and profit and loss accounts. But when it comes to tax rules, particularly complicated tax rules like the managed service company rules, they have probably never heard them before, and it's probably going to be quite confusing to them. So I couldn't use any jargon at all around those rules. I couldn't have any presumed knowledge really at all, apart from, the fact I can talk about a payroll being run and tax and national insurance contributions through a payroll. I knew that they would understand that because any trained accountant will learn about those things. So I could talk about those things, but in relation to the rules themselves, I had to go completely back to basics. And that's what you should be thinking about when you're preparing webinars, is thinking about those people that you're going to be presenting to, and think what they're going to know, what they're probably going to need to know, how you can kind of connect with them the best, what's the terminology that they would use. And there's never going to be a perfect answer to this, by the way, but you've just got to think about it, and you'll get better at this as you kind of do more of them. When people ask questions, when they've clearly misunderstood something, etc., that's direct feedback, and you can use that to help get better in the future. I did kind of touch upon this earlier as well, but it comes back. It is important when it comes to tailoring your language and presentations. But if there is a piece of information that is absolutely vital for people to understand, do not have any presumed knowledge at all. Cover the full thing. Do not think that everyone in that room is going to know enough about that information. Do not take that for granted. Make sure that you cover it so that they can understand everything else that's coming up. So yeah, tip number 10 is to make sure that you tailor your language, webinar and presentation to the people who are attending. So in summary then, for this episode, here are the 9 tips to help you to deliver more impactful, memorable and more engaging webinars. So tell people what is coming up and what they can expect to learn before you get into delivering the webinar. Use the notes section of your Use the notes section within PowerPoint to add in prompts of things that you want to talk about, and also potentially scripts which are basically word for word what you want to say during that presentation. If prompts aren't enough for you. Make sure that your slides, if you are using a presentation or something similar, make sure that they are simple and visual. Do not have lots and lots of text all over the screen, because it'll just be distracting and people won't pay attention to what you're saying. They might as well just be reading what is on the PowerPoint. Make sure that you break down any complicated information into bite-sized chunks and potentially even step by step. Set polls and questions to keep the attendees engaged and make the session more interactive, because it is very easy to switch off during webinars. You know how many times you've probably been on a webinar and you've had a cheeky look at your email or maybe a Teams message and then completely not listened to what was said for ages, and polls and questions are a way to help avoid people do that when they're listening. Try to tell relevant real stories when you're delivering webinars. Stories are much more memorable than just talking about straight facts, and they also make you more relatable, interesting and engaging as well. If you can, try to give some live demonstrations through sharing your screen. Again, it's a way to just vary everything up and keep it interesting, and a lot of the time showing is better than just telling outright how to do something. And if you can as well, and if it's appropriate, set some exercises during the webinar. These do not have to be long, they can just be like a few minutes, but anything to get the attendees thinking and using their brain rather than just passively sitting there and listening to what you've got to say. All that is better to make them pay more attention and to help you convey your message to them and make them understand and remember exactly what it is that you're teaching them. And the last tip is to make sure that you tailor your language and presentation to the people who will be attending your webinar. Thanks for listening to this episode. The show notes can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP67, and within the show notes you can find all the links mentioned throughout this episode, including one to the webinar that I'm doing with MBL on the 8th of March this year, provided, of course, there is enough people enrolled for this to go ahead. I would like this to go ahead, of course, so if you're at all interested in learning about the managed service company rules, or maybe just want to see me present a webinar and get a bit more of a feel for maybe things that could help you get better and so forth, then why not enroll onto that and give it a go. To make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe and sign up for email notifications. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.